Thank you so much for inviting me in your circle. I um, appreciate who you are and familiar with your congregation, and I see at least one person I know in among the circle, former pastor Denise, and thank you so much, Adam. You know, I was a little bit concerned when I saw your live stream the other night and saw you being gassed and all, and I said, well, was wondering whether or not, whether or not you're okay, and I'm glad that you are. But I I appreciate you, and I heard someone else in this circle was also baptized by the feds. So thank you um, for your witness. I appreciate it so much. When Adam asked me to share today, and I wasn't quite sure where to go, but he gave me a few points. So I'll just begin by talking a little bit about who I am and something about my faith, my understanding of the biblical roots about protesting, and I have some questions for us to ponder together. As Adam shared, I'm originally from New York City. I grew up in New York City, and I want for you to hold in your memory right now the names of two couples who are important for me. One is Jane and Joseph Cobb, and the other couple is Charles and Augusta Prescod. When I think about my life and what my life means, and I'm at that point in my life journey, so I have more years behind than I have in the future. So a lot of what I'm thinking about is about what did my life mean, or what will people say about me? And I think of three formative moments in my young life. Um, One was when I was a very young child, and my family went and visited some of our relatives in rural Virginia. This was in 1964, just after Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Bill. That was the first time that I was, as I said, I was a very young child. So my sisters and I went uh, with, with, with my parents, and we got in a station wagon and drove all the way down to visit my mother's family in rural Virginia. Now that was striking in many ways. One was it was the first time I had been outside of New York City, outside of an urban environment, and it was sort of like a whole new world in many different ways. One way it was different was as soon as we got to my Uncle Buddy's home, my sisters, start, jumped out of the car and ran into the fields and took off their shoes. And I think for the next 2 weeks were barefooted. I was a very staid and proper and uptight young boy, and I refused to take off my shoes and run barefoot. Um, the other thing that was related was that I discovered that they did not have indoor plumbing. And the way I remember our 2 weeks in Virginia was that I refused to use the outhouse. Except when we went to town um, on the weekend, was the only time I remember relieving myself, because I didn't have a toilet to flush. So it was all of this was all sort of like new culture shock in many ways. But the most striking thing about that time in New York and Virginia in 1964 was my grandmother, who was the um, granddaughter of Jane and Joseph Cobb, the couple I mentioned at the beginning. Um, she grew up, was born and grew up in Virginia, and when she was a young girl, moved to New York because of she had to run away from the experience of segregation. So she as a teenager, I think she was came to New York when she was maybe 18 or 17 or 18 years old. Came to New York, found a life for her, and we was always very rebellious. My We had a family reunion in Portland a few years ago, and a cousin of ours looked around and looked at the women in my family and said, you know, we come from a rebellious group of broads. We are always on the cutting edge. And that was what my grandmother, Eleanor, was about. So she had to leave Virginia and resisted segregation. So, and she was active in lots of things in New York City and Harlem during the Harlem Renaissance and and active in in politics as well as in the entertainment field. But when we came down to Virginia in 1964, and in addition to trying to understand what it meant to um, uh, that whole rural living. This was, as I said, just a few weeks after Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Bill in 1964. And my grandmother said, okay, everyone, let's go into the car and let's see whether or not we can um, go um, to the Woolworth and get served at the lunch counter. And what I remember about that was, as little kids, we would say, "Yay, we're going, and we're going to go get some soda pop and things like that." And so we got to the store, and my grandmother and probably my parents got out of the car. But what I remember is that my grandmother, sister-in-law, my aunt Rebecca, who grew up in rural Virginia, who was illiterate and very much a child of that environment. She sat in the car um, as if she was frozen. Um, she would not get out of the car um, because I imagine she was afraid of what might happen. Um, the other Another incident I remember from my childhood, which was impacted me, was my uh, um, paternal grandfather. The other couple I mentioned at the beginning of my um, monologue here was Charles and Augusta Prescod. Charles and Augusta were my father's parents. Uh, they too came to New York in the early 20th century, but unlike my maternal side of the family, they were immigrants from the island of Barbados. It was so fascinating for me as I started, doing research in terms of my family background to actually uh, find the name of the ship with my grandmother Augusta Prescod name on it when she came to New York City and went through Ellis Island and Um, and she and my grandfather, who came to New York, I discovered were really young too. They maybe 20 years old, coming to this new country, but leaving a small Caribbean island, coming to New York again to, like my maternal grandmother, to find uh, uh, what it means to live a more full life, welcoming life. And one thing I always remember my grandfather, uh, Charles, used to say sometimes whenever there was like family get together or arguments or discussions, Granddaddy would always say, "I'm an American citizen. I'm an American citizen," as if he wanted to everyone to recognize that he, as as much as anyone else, had a right to be here and to deserve the best that all that our society has to offer. The third influential incident in my growing up year was a few years later. Um, During a time in New York City when there was a lot of uproar around school desegregation. Um, my parents and my family had been active in civil rights and activism in the area, um, but there came a time when busing came to New York's public schools. I was in the eighth grade, and um, so we were that September. We got on the school bus, and we were, my parents tried to prepare me for saying you're going to a different school, you'll meet different people, things will be different, but it will be fine. Um, and so, riding the bus, I'm looking around to see what's different, and all the homes still look the same. All the homes and the yards look the same. I saw no difference. Um, but as this bus went the 2 miles to the white school, um, I didn't see anything different. Things looked the same. Uh, Suddenly, and as the school bus approached the school, um, I saw this crowd of adults in front of the school, and they were yelling and screaming and saying all sorts of things. And one thing I do remember is this man who had a placard around his head uh, that said, KKK, we don't want you in here. Um, and that's when I knew I wasn't in Kansas anymore. Um, it was a time in which um, my parents tried to prepare me beforehand for what it meant to be confronted um, by racial hatred, and um, it was a challenging time for a young person trying to figure out all these things. Um, So those were three formative things in my life, which influenced my understanding of trying to find your place in this great American society, and also recognizing that you, Black people, were not welcome or accepted. How does this all fit into my understanding of faith? I mentioned, Adam mentioned that I'm a minister in the United Church of Christ, and I grew up for the most part, as a child, I grew up in the United Church of Christ. Um, so as a young child in the Prescod Church, and a few years later in the United Church of Christ. And what I remember about, growing up in the church in New York City, it was It was a Black church, and it was part of what we like to say the prophetic tradition. Um, Part of who we were meant protesting and standing up and shouting and going to, NAACP meetings and marching in front of the local supermarket to make sure that they would hire Black people. So it was all part of our tradition, um, praying, we prayed with our feet, marching, as people said, as much as we did worshiping on Sunday. And that's all of who we are, I think. Um, and some of you might be more familiar with the UCC tradition and all that we are. Um, but one thing that we might remember that I often hold on to is our statement of faith, which reminds us of who we are and what we are called to do. And what it says in part is that God calls us into God's church to accept the cost, the joy and cost of discipleship, to be God's fellow servants in the ways of justice and peace. That's in our DNA. We are called to be people who are not only able to pray on Sunday, but to participate in the movement for justice of who we are. Um, this is in our DNA. As Christians, followers of Jesus, as those who embrace the whole story, the Exodus story of the freeing of the slaves in Egypt. That's our story. The prophets who resisted the attempt to put down the people when they were in their new land. That's part of who we are. The story of Jesus and John the Baptist, and their resistance to state power. That's who we are. And so, as we think of who we are, it's not something foreign. It's something we have to reclaim as our own. And as some of you are doing these days, and I think all of us in many different ways, but as some of you who are marching either in your neighborhoods or downtown, we are witnessing to our calling to follow Christ and to also bear witness in our words and in our deeds to the cause of justice and peace. Finally, I just wanted to say a few things about my understanding of this moment that we are living in. Martin Luther King said, expressed his confidence in the history of who we are by quoting from a 19th century clergyman, Theodore Parker, when Martin Luther King said that the moral arc of the universe bend towards justice. And that arc may seem long, and as it bend towards justice, it may seem as if we may not get there. Those of us who have been, I imagine some of us heard the funeral of John Lewis yesterday from Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. And I think among the things that I got from listening and viewing that service was that a reminder that John Lewis was not alone. Um, the most insightful statement that I heard during that, I don't know, 3 or 4 hour service um, was not the words of former President Obama or Clinton or Bush, but was from John Lewis teacher James Lawson, 91 years old, Methodist minister who taught um, John Lewis and a whole slew of young, at that time, students um, in the ways of nonviolent direct action. And what Dr. Lawson said in part during his address to those assembled at Ebenezer Baptist Church, what I appreciated was that he lifted up not only the name of John Lewis, but also called us to remember those whose name we may not know or may forget. And so anytime we talk about the civil rights movement and wax longingly about that golden era, I think we need to remember the names of those who stood up. And for me, at least, that includes the name of those young organizers, and also not only the names of the Black ministers that we know of. And we can spew them out: King and Lowry, Hosea Williams, and later Jesse Jackson, Andrew Young, but also the names of those organizers. And I'm speaking particularly in the name of Black women. Those who, people such as Diane Nash, who was a great strategist and organizer of the sit-ins and the bus boycott and the desegregation of buses, the freedom rides in the South. People like Ella Baker, who actually kept the movement together in many ways. People like Septima Clark, again, a great strategist and someone that the organizer believed in and who challenged time and time again the male Black clergy in many ways. And people like Dorothy Height, who we might know of, but we also must remember who was a member of the, with her would have been the Big Seven, you know, those who are seen as the most influential leaders of the civil rights movement, 6 men, and Dorothy Height, 1 woman, who was not allowed to have a prominent speaking role in the March on Washington in 1963. So I think as we look at that moment and also remember the moment we are in, let us look and remember the voices of those who are doing the hard work, those who will not be called upon to speak necessarily, but those who are the workers who are doing real organizing. And so what I think is important for me and maybe for you as well is for us to listen to the voices of the young people, the young Black people who are leading, who are risking their lives in many ways, and follow them. I don't think it's maybe the time, I know it's not the time for us in our with our institutional power to say, okay, here we are. You guys sit down. You guys and girls sit down, and the adults are in the room now. But rather just to for us to sit back and listen. So those are just a few of my thoughts right now, and I, if anything's interesting, great. If it's not, just delete it and feed your minds with things that you find useful. So thank you for allowing me just to share a little bit. And thank you, Adam, for recording this, because I also, I'm probably not as well disciplined as you, and I still have to prepare a sermon for Sunday. So maybe if this recording as well, maybe I'll just use that for my sermon on Sunday. But thank you all so much.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. We appreciate your time. We wanted to open it up. We have probably about 20 minutes with you with us, and we wanted to open it up for some question and answers. I know I had a lot of aha moments, but Adam will be watching for people to raise their hand, and Adam will unmute. If he's unable, you can unmute yourself.
I think it's also, if it's okay, I'll keep recording this this Q&A session as well. Cecil, I think when you began, you said that you might have some questions for us. Did you have specific questions for us that you?
Well, just a couple, and what do we see is our role at this moment in history? And then and who are the voices that we listen to these days? So what is our role in history? What is our role in this moment right now? And what are the voices and who are the voices we listen to?
Okay, perfect. So everyone, maybe when we, if you want to reflect on that with Cecil while he's here, you can feel free to do that. Maybe we will reflect on that when we get those questions when we go into our smaller groups. And if you have responses to Cecil, questions that you might like to ask, as Amira said, many things impacted her. Feel free to raise your hand and I'll bring you in. Amira, yeah.
So for me, the first thing that really popped out to me was that's in our DNA, talking about the UCC. For me, it's really been kind of eye-opening the last 2 months, being very awakened to things that were that have been happening in the world that I wasn't paying attention to. And then on the flip side, being so active in what's happening. I may not be out protesting, but I'm very, very active in other ways, and getting a lot of pushback from loved ones about being too loud. And I think someone had mentioned that my dad could be scared. I talked about my dad and him and I butting heads, that I'm being a little too loud, and they brought up fear. And so I've kind of sat with that and realized that he may be fearful for me, and that's okay, but this is where I belong. It kind of, not that I didn't know that anyway, but this church and my church, this is where I belong, and this is what we are about. And it just really hit home when you said that. So thank you.
Thank you, Amira. And I think, if you get pushback, you're probably headed on the right road. And if I may, I think, um, again, I'm a student of history. I love reading history. And I think it's great that everyone just, again, are saying, wonderful things about John Lewis right now. But also, I think I need to remember and remind myself that oftentimes he was on the outside and he was um, thought of as being too pushy. And we remember, in the March on Washington, we say here that he was the youngest speaker at that march. Um, but those in power, I mean, the Civil Rights Authority, um, um, thought his original speech was too radical. He was being too pushy. That he criticized President Kennedy in his original speech, and they literally took him to the side of the monument and had him rewrite his speech. Um, some of that radicalness is still in there, but it's helpful for me to remember that sometimes we can be too pushy and too loud, and maybe that's what we're called to do. So
Thank you.
thank you, Amira.
Yes, PB.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Hi, Cecil. I don't know if you remember me. I'm Pat Becken, and you and I had connected and did some training post the Malaguta Sarah murder via the Tools for Diversity trainings. Do you recall that? I don't know.
Yes, I remember you back. Yeah, yeah.
How are you?
Yeah, great.
So I'm curious. I mean, that was what, 25 years ago.
Yeah, 30,
So
25
yeah,
years.
so I think back on that, and I'm wondering, in your opinion, what kind of what's the term I'm trying to use? Progress do you feel that we've made in the last? We're showing our age here, Cecil. Quarter century in racial justice.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great, Pat. And I sometimes I share with people that for me at least, after I moved to Portland, and after I was so enamored with the environment and the weather and the mountains that that killing of Mulligata Sarah woke me up from my slumber here in Portland. And and at that period in time, like we were a lot younger, and I was involved in groups, much like the groups that we see downtown right now.
Yeah.
And I even saw someone who had a poster, did a poster. I don't know if you remember the name, Jonathan Masaki, with the Coalition for Human Dignity, CHD. But he found a poster somebody had posted from way back that said "Fight Racism." So it was this old poster from 25 years ago. And so thinking about how much progress we've made, it's sort of like, I don't know, it just seems like we just have to keep on pushing and pushing. And part of what, the DNA of Oregon is this entrenched racism that's part of who I think how our state became a state. And it seems to me we have to continue to push against it in terms of the institutional forms. So yeah, I see your face, Pat, and that makes me smile. But then you remind me about, we haven't gotten very far.
Well, one thing that resonated with me when you said in your opening comments that we have more days behind us than we do ahead of us, and That's true. And I feel like we were those young people back then. I mean, what we were in our 30s at the time, and the difference I feel is that um, I I feel like we didn't have as much backup as I feel is happening today. I mean, I've been down to the protests a couple times, and they I'm really impressed. I really am at the youth and the clarity and the stalwartness. Like I feel like, to me, that's the difference. And I feel like at my age now, my job is to stand behind them, maybe next to them, but definitely behind them, and challenge the people in my generation that they're not young people who don't know what they're talking about. I feel like they're young people who don't have as much crap that they're dragging around. Therefore, they have clarity.
Mhm. Yeah, Pat, I think maybe I'll revise my last statement after hearing what you just said. Is that the hope I do have is what you just pointed out, is the backup they have and their analysis in terms of the intersectionality.
Hmm.
And so it isn't, um, 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 and the recognition of the connection of all these things.
Hmm.
So that whether you're talking about climate justice or racial justice or or LGBTQI justice, they are interrelated. And oftentimes, when I hear these younger people speaking, they make that very crystal clear.
Right.
Um, and so maybe us older folks, we can say, oh, maybe we did something good, just pushing it a little bit. But yeah,
Thank you.
thank you, Pat.
Denise.
Hey, Cecil, I think that they would love to hear how your calling called you to move from New York to Portland, and a bit about your ministry within the church and the churches you serve, but also with your public ministry at KBOO Radio, because I think they would love to hear about that.
Okay. Yeah, this is like an old timer club right now. Denise and I knew one another when we were a few years younger. And so actually I came to Portland in the 80s for 1 year because I wanted to do an internship um, at what was at that time, um, well, yeah, it was the only Black UCC church at Highland UCC Church, which um, later developed into the Highland Christian Center and is no longer part of this denomination. Um, but I came here in the mid '80s to work with that church in at that point, pre-gentrification in the Northeast Portland, and all of the challenges and blessings of working with that, at that time, a very small congregation with a lot of young people. Since that time, it's been a long year, like 34 years it has morphed into. I've also have been doing radio on KBOO, a talk radio program with Celeste Carey on Monday mornings, and we've been doing that for a long time, and that's an opportunity to sit and hear different voices and to speak with one another. And part of what I don't know, I have to look at my resume and maybe my, soon to be obituary in terms of lists of groups and things I participated in, but a lot around social justice issues, a lot around LGBTQI issues. And, Denise, you remember back in the day when that was, what was it, the OCA and
Oh my goodness, yeah.
right. And
We were protesting in similar manners for that particular cause at that time.
yeah. So a lot, we've done a lot. And again, I think it's related to, for me at least, it's being a member of the UCC, and which intersected with my understanding of justice. So it was a good fit.
I think we probably have time for one more. Rich.
Electronics.
Yes.
Unmute. I'm Rich, I'm he. And Cecil, I have a question for you. In the works that you did, do you recall a young lady by the name of Margaret Butler, Tabu? You're shaking your head. God bless you, brother.
Yes.
She was our cousin. And, her life was taken on the Columbia River.
Yes.
It's one of those things where if a fisherman has his daily limit and passes away after the catch of the second one, everything is okay. She was on a sailboat and she was helping crew a boat, and it was just an unfortunate accident.
Yeah.
But one of the things, just real briefly, I listened to you, and like your comment, so many years in the past, so many years, but not so many in the future. And I pray to my Lord, please don't let me waste any more time. In the past, yes, I was a sinner and I did some great things too. And I was kind of renowned for being, kind of intense and getting down to the truth of things. But my Christianity never was part of that. But yet I felt I was a strong Christian. Since being part of the United Church of Christ, it has caused me to kind of completely change over. And I seek out now and fall in love with those who really are seeking out the truth. And I do that through the protests, and I love to listen and hear and learn and then practice. Practice is the most important thing. So the ways of old are gone, the ways of new are young. And so I pray that I have enough time so that I can make an imprint of positiveness in the future for equality and justice, mercy and grace. Thank you. Cecil, you are inspiring.
Thank you, and thank you for your words. And like you, I hope that I can make a difference. One thing that I'm learning is to embrace my new position on this life journey.
Amen.
And so I don't know how many, and so I say, okay, I'm an elder. What is it? How do I mentor? How do I share? How do I listen? That's one thing that I think that I'm called to do is just to be a listening board sometime. And if they ask me a question, to share what I have around. And for those of you who have not seen, I think it was, yesterday, New York Times, it was sort of John Lewis, I don't know, want to say last will and testament, but sort of his last words to the next generation. It was so inspiring and so reminded me of how even when we are on our last leg, we have something to share and to give. And yes. So yeah, pick up New York Times yesterday if you want to be inspired by, continue to be inspired by John Lewis.
Cecil, thank you so much. I know that you have to run to your next meeting. we're inspired by John Lewis, and as Rich said, we are inspired by you. And the one of the things that really struck me, that resonated with me, is when you said that you're not alone, and we are in this together. And I am so grateful for your ministry in this conference and for you joining us today. So thank you so much, Cecil.